So what I have been doing for past few years, and mainly a lot for last year or two, is trying to see if I can apply the concept of role play as a tool for teaching as well as formative assessment in my classes. As we go through, I'm going to highlight the work that I've done mostly in my introductory biology classes and how that has worked for that student population. I will like to say, though, that a lot of these role play activities are great for a lot of different classes, not just classes in the STEM field, but as I did more research for the presentation, I also found a lot more examples of this in a lot of different fields, even things like economics and arts and history. There were many, many examples of role play and how that has been a active learning tool for many different classes and for formative assessment. So I would like to highlight that before we go into the details. So just a little bit into what is role play and in what context are we using it today. So as we talk about role play, we're talking about the students taking on this role. They're taking on the role of a particular person. So if it was a history class, different people and doing an act on that, or if it was like for my biology class, they were talking about a phenomena, a process. So they were taking on a role of a component in that process. And while they do that, we want to examine a specific topic or issue through the lens of their roles. So when they all kind of select on different roles and play the entire process together, we explore that course-related topic. And it's a form of experiential learning. That's what we were trying to get at. It is a mode of active learning, and we want to facilitate that by allowing the students to take on this role and make it more student-centered instead of the professor standing in the front of the classroom providing a lecture on that topic. What I was more looking at, well, that is going to be essential. So I always start off with doing a short lecture, about 15, 20 minutes on the topic. I highlight the key components. I would draw out the process on the board. But then what I felt that the part that was missing is for me to know if the students were really getting that idea or not. And what were the gaps? Which part of the process was difficult for them to understand and for them to conceptualize? So doing this as the next step before they get to any form of formal assessment was really helping them kind of understand the topic and kind of in real time show me where the gaps were so that we could address them as we go through the process. So that's a picture of my students in general biology 1 class, and they were doing a role play on oxidative phosphorylation, and that's the video that we'll watch towards the end. So why even do role play? So for the reasons that we have been talking for the past few minutes, it's mainly about providing a means for active learning. It's for immediate feedback, which was one of the essential things that I was looking at. Is I wanted feedback on how are they doing, because often when you lecture on a topic like this, I go through oxidative phosphorylation, I'm drawing things on the board, I'm going back and forth on the lecture, and then when I look at their faces, it is so hard to tell what's going on. Like, some are just totally blank faces and nobody's asking a question, and it gets really hard to judge, if it's going well or not. So from that perspective, I really wanted to see, where are they struggling? Are you even getting somewhere? What's going on? So the follow-up step definitely helped with that. I did see after doing more role play and more sequential role play in the course that it definitely promotes a lot of this lifelong learning, or it even allows them to apply this knowledge that they got in the lecture portion beforehand to kind of addressing their understanding and asking questions. Asking questions was something that got so much better when we started doing role play, because then they really had questions to ask and say, well, what happens to this person? Or what happens to this character in the process? Where did this go? And where did this come from? Which were questions I was hoping to hear when I was lecturing. But it was just so much for them to take in to even start asking those questions. So I always had those one or two people in the front row asking the questions, but I really needed more engagement. So that's what the role play could help with. Those are some of the strengths that it can help with. It demonstrates a very practical integration of knowledge, skills, and ability. So that is an important takeaway that we need in our classes is how can we do that? And then, it allows people to appreciate complexity and to be able to understand it so they can apply it in problem solving. So those were some of the key takeaways as to why do role play and what can it help with. It can help a lot of topics that intersect between different curriculums or different fields. So it can help us blend those things together. So before I dive a little bit into how to plan for a role play, how to execute it, and some examples, what I did was I started looking up some scientific research on application of role play and designing of role play. I found a lot of papers, which is always a good thing. So I started off with something more recent. So in 2018, there was an article published on role-playing activity to demonstrate diffusion across a cell membrane. Obviously, this is one of the key topics that we talk about in Introduction to Biology. It is an essential concept for them to understand, especially the difference of general diffusion versus osmosis, and there is a lot of mixing between the two that the students do. So it's really, really helpful for them to have this role play, which allows them to distinguish parts of it, the components involved in diffusion and how does it work and what's happening to the cell and what impact can it have. So this paper that ran into a lot of detail about the design and how the role play was executed and the results of it, which was very fascinating to learn about. So I kind of felt like there was more confidence on how this can work and what can we do about it. On the side, to the right, I'm showing you a paper this is from 2000. It's about a role-playing mitosis activity. And this paper also had really good detail about how to set the stage for the activity, how to prepare the students, how to kind of differentiate them. So in that activity, they had done a lot about having different colored jerseys for the kids and giving different ones to the ones that are pretending to be chromosomes versus the ones that were pretending to be the cell membrane, and helping with designing, so visually separating them from each other with the help of that color-coded jerseys, and then giving them the role of doing a certain part of their mitosis process. They started off first with the big picture and about what happens to the cell at the start and what end product you get. And then they called upon different groups to demonstrate each phases of mitosis. So that also kind of helped a lot with understanding the process, and then the students were asked to do follow-up activities, like either write up something about it or talk about it to their class to showcase their understanding. So those were great things to start off with. There was a really important protein synthesis model that I saw about role-playing in classroom. There were actually two. This is an older paper from this was the oldest I think I found, from 1993 or something. And it had a really good model of students pretending to be mRNA or DNA or tRNA and different amino acids, and they all were given these note cards with different codes on them. And then they would play this act where everybody knew their role, and they would go and match up their codes to kind of show the translation of the message as you go from the code on the DNA to mRNA and to the synthesis of the protein at the end of the process. There was a newer version of this that I also saw in a more recent paper. I'll come back to this, but I want to show you that. Yeah, this is the newer version that I had. This was a more recent paper on protein synthesis role play in a more larger setting, and this was for a human anatomy and physiology class in 2009. And they had a lot of students. They had about 298 students in 2 sections. They obviously separated them out to do this study, but the study was very well done with control groups and study groups, and they did pre and post test assessments on the effect of the role play, and they were able to give these different roles to the students to do to kind of showcase how it works. So that was a really neat thing to do, because protein synthesis is a concept that so many students struggle with and have a difficulty understanding how all of these components, like the message on the DNA, mRNA, tRNA, and the amino acids match up together, and to see all of it as one picture could really help. There was another more recent study on glycolysis and Krebs cycle, and using role play to highlight that. This was where they were looking at the process of glycolysis, and students would model being a glucose molecule. So they would get 6 students, get them to bind by holding their hands, and they would become a glucose molecule. And then they would pretend how that would break down to get to all the way to pyruvate. They would distribute the classroom and separate out the sections with tables to showcase cytoplasm differently from the mitochondria, and then how it would enter the mitochondria and then undergo the Krebs cycle. So it was a really good model to kind of allow students to visually see where all of this is happening inside a cell, so that they could recall that a little better, and then also understand how the molecule is changing over time. And there was also another one on human chromosome play by students helping out with mitosis and meiosis and comparing the two. So again, this one involved more of the color coding of the different jerseys for the different students, and kind of putting them in different places and showing how the doubling of chromosomes will happen, how they would separate into new daughter cells that are being produced, showing the formation and the dissolution of the nuclear envelope with the help of a student group forming a circle. So all of those were concepts that really helped them start looking at the process. There was another anatomy and physiology class where they had kind of pretend models to be calcium ions, and how you could look at the regulation of calcium ions by looking at the function of hormones, and looking at negative feedback for the endocrine regulation. So this showcase their setup of how that works. And that was the last protein one. Okay. So now that we have looked at a couple of examples out there in the literature, things are ranging all the way from 1900s, late 1900s to 2020, all the way. I've seen examples of this. There were more examples of this happening a lot at elementary school level, middle school level, and high school level, which is great. We want those kids to have the exposure to applying this knowledge more actively in their classrooms, so they have a strong foundation when they got to college. But when they get to college, we also want to make sure that they get a similar experience. It's not that we would just lecture to them and they would write down and they would have to recall the information and put it on a test. We want to see how they're applying this knowledge, how they're able to ask questions that are more deeply involved in the content. So for that reasons, this can be a great tool to explore with them. So in terms of how do you conduct a role play and how would you get started? So some recommendations are to identify a learning objective for the lesson first. We always want to use that backward design is first know what we are supposed to achieve in that course, looking back at the course outline and then the lesson that you're planning to achieve that. You want to craft or choose a scenario around that context. And then have the students either research their roles ahead of time or work from a list of prepared characteristics. Now, just a little bit of tip on this. If this is the first few times you're doing this in your classroom, you might want to provide them with a prepared characteristic list for the roles. So that they have a model or they have seen something beforehand. And then it might be good to provide them moving forward in the class with the ability to research their own roles, write up a short summary about what the component is, what does it do, what role does it have in the process, so that they have a stronger foundation on how to do this. So they have more support and they have done this to be more informed as to how to research their roles and do it. You also want to prepare the students with your expectation. You want to be very clear in providing them guidelines about what they're supposed to do before that lecture when they are going to do a role play, what they're supposed to bring prepared, and what are the basic expectations of their participation in that activity. That really helps kind of have a leveled playing field that everyone is prepared as they get started with the role play, and then everyone is contributing to that knowledge. Be willing also to step back and allow the conversation to flow as the students proceed. There have been times when the students might have something in mind and they would start the role play and go about that. And I usually step back and see how things go and let them rehearse it a couple of times. And I would rather when something doesn't look as properly fitting the objective, or if it's not the right role, I would wait for another student to help out that student before me stepping into it and saying, this is how you want to do this, because that really allowed them to undergo that discussion about maybe this is what I thought about this role, about this component in the process, and maybe this is how you want to do this. And if we let the peers figure it out and work through the process, it went really and then what you could do is you could also take on a role and be a part of them. So in oxidative phosphorylation and some other processes, I also took on a role and I did the same thing with them as I had a cardboard with a tag and I knew what I was doing, and then I just worked with them in the role so that they kind of felt like we were all a part of it. And plan a debrief. Ask the students to reflect on it. So plan it in the time frame where you are going to have those last 5-10 minutes to debrief and reflect on what you did. Maybe have a follow-up next lecture or towards the end of the lecture if you have time to test their knowledge using problems or questions. So in the past, I've used Kahoot quizzes to test how they're doing because it helped me, again, real time, see where the gaps were and to address it right then if there was something that was still missing. You could use concept mapping or worksheets like problem worksheets in the classroom to help test and see how they're doing. So those were all formative assessments that I've used in the class to kind of see how things go after the role play. A couple of considerations to keep when you're planning your role play is each occurrence of a role play situation is different. So enjoy the variety. It never ends up being the same. Every time I've done the different activities like oxidative phosphorylation or macromolecule simulation, they all end up being different. It's a different group of people. It's a different group. It's a different level of engagement. It is a different level of preparedness. Every occurrence ends up being very different. Every occurrence has a very different discussion that goes on and a very different debriefing that goes on after it. So there is going to be a lot of variety with that. And don't be afraid to start small. Actually, the recommendation is start small. It's easier for you to see how it goes and for you to modify from there. And their role play are always successful in short or long time frames. So it might be good to start small and then to build on it. So here are some examples of my experience with role play from my general biology class. And I have used short role play activities versus long role play activities. I'm going to give you an example of a short versus a long so that we can look at both. For the short role play activity, I have done dehydration reaction activities with the students, hydrolysis reaction, and DNA antiparallel strands. I'll show you an example of how I've used the dehydration reaction activity. And then we'll move on to a more longer version on the long role play activity like the oxidative phosphorylation. I've also used a similar concept in the process of photosynthesis with the photophosphorylation role play. And then have done similar things like the protein translation process with the DNA replication, and the gene expression is where the protein translation comes into play. So let me show you the example of macromolecule problem. This usually does not take long. Even with the debriefing and all of the discussion, it takes 5 minutes. So I want to show you the type of information that we would have already discussed in lecture before getting to this point of role play. So I would have already gone through explaining to them how the formation and breakdown of macromolecules would occur. I would have given them this visual of dehydration reaction, talking about synthesis of a polymer, a hydrolysis reaction, breaking down a polymer, and then structure of macromolecule depending on the structure. So talking about how it depends on the structure of their monomers, the number of monomers linked together, and the three-dimensional ways in which the monomers link. There is also an animation link that you see on the bottom, so I will always play that when I go over this in the lecture component, which is the 15-20 minutes talking about that. I tag along that with the protein structure that we would have talked about in that lecture, and we would have talked about the different levels of structure to form a protein. So they knew about it, and they also knew in product how for certain proteins you could have a quaternary structure, which was built by multiple polypeptides. So they would have had this knowledge, and they would have talked about this in lecture before. I would have played this protein structure animation with them when we went through that portion of the lecture. So this is what we did on the lecture component. And then what I would do is on this day when I'm planning the role play, I would start off as soon as they come in class, I would give them this problem worksheet. And this is the problem that they would see. How many water molecules would be produced from dehydration reaction associated with making a protein that has a primary structure consisting of 209 amino acids and that has a quaternary structure consisting of 5 subunits? As soon as they read this, I noticed majority of the class did not know where to start. Okay? Even though we had talked about dehydration reactions, we had talked about protein structures and how they're formed. It was just like, I don't know, where do we get started, right? Remember, this is an introductory general biology class. They're just getting started and they're learning how to apply this knowledge. So this all happens in Unit 1. And so we hit a roadblock. So I go around, I give them 5 minutes, I go around, I have them working in pairs, and I ask them, so what are we doing? Where are we getting started? What do we recall about dehydration reaction and the primary structure and the quaternary structure? I get a few answers and I jot them down on the board. And we still haven't, there are very few groups that have actually made some progress on the dehydration reaction or how that would work. So then what I do is, rather than solving it for them on the board, I would say, well, I need a few volunteers. And then I would have those volunteers stand up in the front of the classroom. Typically tend to use about 10 to 12 students, and they would stand in the front of the classroom holding their hands like this animation that you're seeing on my screen. So they would hold hands, and then I would tell them, well, this is a polymer. Okay, so I would here, again, I'm going to say, this is a protein that we're talking about. And then I would have them count the number of bonds by counting the number of hand holdings that we see. Then they would count the number of water molecules that were involved in building them. So I would have them break the bonds and do both dehydration and hydrolysis in a sequence. So they would first unlock their hands, and then we would do one bonding at a time. So they would undergo one dehydration reaction, hold the hands, and showcase the formation of a bond. And I would give them markers. So each individual is holding 2 markers. And those markers will then be used to highlight the losing of the hydrogen and the hydroxide between the bond that is being produced. So they loop that together and they throw it onto the floor, showing how water molecule was released in that reaction. And then they would keep forming the bonds. So we would play that animation a couple of times back and forth, forming it, breaking it down, forming it, breaking it down. And then I would have another group stand up, forming another polypeptide. And then they would come together to show you, well, how multiple subunits can be put together to build that quaternary structure, so that now they could count the number of water molecules involved, and they could see the pattern, how you need to multiply the number of protein subunits to the number of water molecules involved to get to the answer. So that kind of helped them, again, get back to this problem. So once we do the role play, they go back in their groups of 2. So they partner together, and then they start working through it. And then once they solve it, they know it's actually just a 2-step thing. And it's so much easier to solve that problem once they get that concept. So I've applied this for over 5 semesters now, and I've seen so much success with this role play, where initially there was a major roadblock how to get even started. Once we do the role play, which takes about 5 minutes, then majority of the class is on board as how do I get started with this and how do I solve for it. So that was one of the short play activities. For the long play activities with the oxidative phosphorylation, I would lecture on the components of the oxidative phosphorylation. We would separate out the electron transport chain and the chemiosmosis part, talk about the components involved in it. I also play an animation on this to show give them some idea about how the electrons and protons are being transported through this, and how ATP is being synthesized. So we go through that. And then what I do is, usually for this, I do the lecture one day, and then I assign them roles and ask them to either look at the list of characteristics that I've provided for the roles, or have them research it. So depending on your class, if you know this is a class where you can venture out and provide them with, like, here's your role, you need to write up about it, bring it next time, and if that can go well, that's great. to get them to do that before they come in next lecture to get started. So 8:30 in the morning, next day, I'm going to tell them, well, let's rehearse your roles and act it out. Perfect. Usually when they get started with the lecture, they're still all just trying to wake up. But when we have a role play, they're all active and working towards it. So we get them to rehearse the roles the next time they come in and act it out. To do that, I always have these kind of colored papers that I use for them to write out their roles on and stick it on them so that they remember who they are and everyone else can read what they are. And then they're going to rehearse this a couple of times before they do the final version. But each one had a choice of picking out which role they wanted to be, which they did the lecture before. And then they had researched, they had watched a few more animations that I had given them and a couple of the lecture note reading that was assigned to them. Okay, so here are some pictures from that active learning that we did in class on oxidative phosphorylation. And let me show you the video of it. It shows you how the electrons are coming to, let me stop sharing this, and then I think I will be able to share the video. Okay, let's give this a try. So in this video, you will see that there is a group of students coming in who are bringing the electrons and protons. This is the first NADH that is coming with electrons and protons to the very first NADH dehydrogenase. And using the markers, there are the protons and electrons to pass them down the chain. The protons are being pumped out, so they're throwing them on their back. And then there was another student on the back collecting the protons, bringing it to ATP synthase. Then there is another group of students coming right behind NADH with FADH2 from the Krebs cycle. And then they are bringing more electrons and protons and donating it to the second protein up there, which is FADH2 dehydrogenase. And then they're again passing the electrons and protons down the chain. And then somebody collecting the protons on the back and bringing them to ATP synthase. So that's what we will see up here.
ATP, 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 yay. ATP, more ATP, yay, ATP. Good job, guys.
So one thing that I want to highlight as you saw this, you also noticed that the students were kind of going down a little bit in their position and they were going up, going down and going up. So what we did was, as they were doing it, we had talked about how you want to show the reduced state versus oxidized state of the cytochromes and all of the proteins in the electron transport chain. So as they get reduced, I'd ask them to kind of go down. And then as they get oxidized by moving the electron further, they would go up again. So they were constantly going down to show the reduction and oxidation that happens in the electron transport chain. You also saw the oxygen as the final electron acceptor that accepted the electron and got reduced to water. So that was another student on the side, Matt, who was getting them and was walking it up as water. So the water leaving the system. So it's pretending to do that. And then at the very end, there was a student who was rotating around and around, who was the ATP synthase. So we talked about how the protons would come to him, and ATP synthase being a turbine, so he would go round and round to synthesize, to develop that proton motive force and synthesize ATP. So this was just one of the rehearsals. We would rehearse this a couple of times, and then everyone would call out what their role was. They would talk about it. They would help each other, and then they would keep doing it one times more to understand it. So that's how we kind of worked on that. I'm going to stop sharing this and come back to the presentation. So a couple of takeaways from this. So from my experience, this definitely made my students more active at 8:30 a.m. in the morning. I had fewer instances of people coming in late. They were more prepared when they got started. They were very excited to be enrolled. So I also had them, I gave them choices to what they wanted to be. So mostly they were able to pick what they want to do. And there was a lot of discussion back and forth. This was a very lively activity where they constantly went back and forth to talk about it and to rehearse. The rehearsal was the best because that's when they really hashed out a lot of this, what to do, and who's doing what, and where are we going, and when are we pretending to get reduced versus oxidized and rotating. So that helped a lot. And the students were very helpful to each other to help play the roles. It definitely helped them recall what we had learned in the lecture before. So this was one of my major goals, is I really wanted them to apply this and kind of read up on what are we doing, how do we apply it, ask questions. There were so many well-crafted conceptual questions that they were asking when they were rehearsing their role, because now that they were doing it, they were like, okay, so if I'm ATP synthase, what am I supposed to do? What is my structure like? If I'm NADH and I'm passing these electrons and protons, what should happen to me? So we talked about how you become NAD plus and you go back to your glycolysis or Krebs cycle phase. So we talked about all of those components that they would have, more questions about, and they would want to learn more about. And they definitely developed a higher level of understanding as to what was going on in the process than just me lecturing or showing them a video over it. Them being in more control over this made a very big difference. I definitely have some updates that I want to do. And every time I do this, like I said, it's very different. And every time I do it, I write down notes on a couple of more additions I want to do. Like I want to have different color coding that could help a little more with keeping track of who is the component of electron transport chain versus what is coming from outside, where is it going. I want to use different colored balls that are labeled for electrons and protons, so it's easier to track them and bring them back to ATP synthase. I also want to have a more slower version of this where each part gets to talk. It could be a 15-second about what they are and what are they doing while they do it. So those are some updates that I was working on while I'm crafting this for future semesters. This was a video from this fall semester, and I've practiced this a little more for the spring semester kids right before spring break, so we made it in, and hopefully we'll get to do this more future semesters. And so, yeah, so at this point, we could talk a little bit about how you have or could use this role play in your classes and in your field and what ideas you have. I'm going to stop sharing this so we can have a discussion. So at this point, feel free to unmute yourself and we can have a discussion. And I'm going through the chat to see what I could have missed. Yeah, nutrition classes also have a lot of these processes where you could definitely apply them. That would be great. Yeah, so I have actually been researching now a little bit more on how this could be done virtually. Um, Obviously, it's not going to be like what we have done in the classroom, but I have looked at some ideas about how you can have them build some models that they can now pretend like you could use a box and you can color code the different box to be different proteins in the electron transport chain, and then students could record short videos of them, showing how the electrons are passing through and how protons are being tossed around and they are coming back. So it's not really a role play in the sense that where we talk about students coming together to do it all, but if we can give a very small, or it could be just like showcasing a phase of mitosis, and we could assign different groups of students and say, well, can 2 or 3 people work on displaying this? Can 2 or 3 people work on displaying this? And then we can share it on a discussion board where everyone brings it together. Or if you're using Zoom, even better, you could have all of those kind of put together into one video, and then you could showcase it where they're showing all of the faces. So there are ways to adapt this. I'm definitely going to try some of that this upcoming fall. Again, I'm going to start small because this is the time when I'm really experimenting how this is going to go online. So I'm going to pick 2 activities that I can maybe adapt online, and I'm going to assign that to students and then have a discussion board where they can post those videos and then watch each other's videos and comment about it, so that we can see how this could work online. I hope that's addressing some of the questions we had. Pascal, I definitely have not done this yet in the second half of the spring because luckily we were done with all of the respiration, photosynthesis, and all of those major role plays in Unit 1 and 2. Unit 3, there were a couple that I love to do, but with all of the last minute changes and going up, we haven't. But I would love to do that in the fall.
I'm wondering if that could be created as a collaborative project where they pass something to each other by just moving it from one side of the screen to the other, and then have maybe one person who is the video editor and puts all the pieces together.
Put together. That's great. Yeah, I can definitely try that. Because those are small acts they can do, like with the macromolecule or the electron transport, they can do that. And it doesn't even have to be the whole process, even if they can just showcase how electrons are passing and them doing that reduction oxidation by standing up and down can really help them because they forget when they talk about the electron transport chain how those electron carriers get reduced and oxidized on the way. So that could be good. That's great. Anyone else has tried any role play in their classes that they would like to share?
I haven't done role play per se, but I had students create demos. They worked in groups where one person did the demo at home, whomever had, and it was related to cooking and chemistry. They did the video of the experiment. One person was in charge of creating narration and text, and another person was putting the video together.
That's great. Yeah. That allows them to kind of see how they're doing it. Anyone else would like to share what they have done? Okay. And if you do have any questions about any of the material I went over, or you need help researching a role play example in any of the fields, want some ideas, feel free to reach out to me. And I hope it helps you think about short activities that you could do with your students and can help them visualize the concept and practice it. Okay, so thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I hope you have a good day.